Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weebunion, and in this one there are several developments across the front line. The Ukrainians continue their attempts to enter the Kursk region, but so far are ending in complete failure, where their forces are being demolished at the border. There's several pieces of footage that shows the Ukrainian vehicles being stopped at the initial entry. This geolocated footage here near Novy Put at the Kursk border shows a convoy of Ukrainian vehicles passing through a defensive line with dragon teeth, 3 layers of them. The Ukrainian forces are here stopped at the border, being struck by Russian AFU drones, artillery. The Ukrainians also managed to enter Tetkino across the border area, where they were struck by FAB bombs. The Ukrainians managed to gain a foothold within the town of Tetkino at the outskirts of it, but the Russians have already started counterattacks to push them back out. This shows that the Ukrainians so far have been completely unable to establish a foothold across, and they're being met with heavy resistance already at the border crossing. The situation for the Russians has completely changed compared to August of last year, where the Ukrainians launched their larger scale operation to enter the Kursk region. The Ukrainians also attempt to push the Russians out of Luknia. With this geolocated footage, we see that the Ukrainians are operating tanks in the town of Luknia, trying to push the Russians out by launching these counterattacks. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainians are intensifying their offensive operations in the north, yet so far they are failing to make any significant developments. Instead, in the Toretsk direction, the Ukrainians have had some larger success, where they have managed to cut off the main supply line of the Russian forces into the industrial area west of the city. The Ukrainians are here looking to encircle the Russian forces operating within the industrial area by capturing the fortified positions in the north. This is why the Russians need to secure the waste heaps in the north of the city. Unless they secure them, then their forces operating west of the city will constantly be in danger. The Russians are working on encircling the Ukrainian forces, however, are so far failing to do so. Instead, the Ukrainian operation here has put the Russian grouping of forces in extreme danger, as they are almost completely encircled. The only supply route for the Russians is through an open field, where the Ukrainians have direct fire control over it. Therefore, the Russian forces operating in the industrial area are operationally encircled by the Ukrainian forces. To the north of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have launched an offensive operations, capturing some of the high ground north of the city. The Russians are here expanding their zone of control around the crossings for further offensive operations towards the defensive lines of the Ukrainians in the area and to improve their positions around the city. This advance was geolocated with this footage here. In the direction of Pokrovsk, there are several developments to the east and to the west of the city. To the east, the Russians have secured the remaining parts of Novolenivka, as well as the fortified positions to the northwest of the town. As we see with this geolocated footage here, the Russians managed to take control over the outskirts of the town. They also managed to capture some prisoners from the Ukrainian fortified positions and trenches northwest of the town. This allowed the Russians to secure the general area around the town, as well as a launch offensive operations towards the forest lines to the east of the river line. The Russians started fighting over the fortified positions southwest of Novolenivka to expand their situation further. The Russians also, with the capture of the first lines east of the town, are able to flank the Ukrainian positions near Encircled and are looking to cut off some of the supply routes further north. They are fairly isolated from nearby towns of the Ukrainians. Therefore, the Russians may be looking to make use of these roads to flank Soria, Encircled, and Romanivka from the rear, and to move onwards towards the cutting off the supply lines and encircling the Ukrainian forces in the area by combining their forces from the east towards Romanivka and from the west towards the rear. The Russians also launched additional operations northwest of Tarasivka, gaining control of the fortified positions there. Russians are looking to secure the area around the highway and the fortified positions to the east of it, south of Novolenivka and northwest of Tarasivka. With combined operations from the south and from the north, they're looking to pincer the Ukrainian fortified positions, attacking from both sides and cutting off their supply routes. This allowed the Russians to secure their positions along the highway up towards Novolenivka, where they can continue offensive operations further north in the direction of Yablonivka and westwards of the highway as well. The Russians are seeing much more success here on the western flank along the fortified positions of the area here between Toretsk and the intersection than in the Toretsk direction, where the Ukrainians continue their attempts at counterattacking and re-entering the city. The Russians here looked to encircle some of the Ukrainian positions, but it seems they were overly ambitious as they stretched out their forces towards the industrial area before securing the flanks of such an operation. The Ukrainians are taking advantage of that. Based on this, we can see that the Russians are looking to encircle the Ukrainian forces in the area, but it will become difficult if they do not secure the city of Toretsk first. Therefore, we may see the Russians focusing more on the eastern flank over the coming weeks. It is also possible that they can double down on their positions here to the west, where they'll look to secure the highway area and the fortified positions, following which they can flank the Ukrainian positions from the rear. But this will require withdrawal of their forces from the industrial zone and back into the city, where they can turn to the defensive. This will decrease the pressure that they are putting on Ukrainian forces and allow the Ukrainians to redirect some of their forces to the west. Therefore, the Russians may look to double down on both directions, launching further offensive operations both near Toretsk and the western flank. To the west of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to advance to the northwest of Usmenivka into the town of Novoserhivka. The Russians launched offensive operations west of the fortified positions and into the town, where they're looking to expand the positions north of the Solona River, along with their advances to the south near Novoalexandrivka. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the supply roads and the town here along the river line, to isolate it from Dashne and to flank the town from the south. It will also allow the Russians to start offensive operations towards Novomykolaivka from the south and from the north of the river line. The Russians also managed to advance west of Kotlyarivka, where they're closing in on the border area and flanking Muravka from the south. If they're able to capture Muravka from the south and Novoserhivka from the north, they will isolate Novomykolaivka by encircling it from the west and from the east, leaving the only crossings across the river line, making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to supply the forces within the town. The Russians will look to gain control over the fortified positions in the area and to encircle the Ukrainian positions. The Russians also managed to gain a foothold within the town of Troitsk in the eastern parts of it. We see it with this geolocated footage. Based on this, we can see that the Russians continued offensive operations despite the ceasefire that will happen tonight at midnight local time. This means that the Russians will either have to withdraw from the town or to stay within their foothold, and if the Ukrainians attack them first, they can respond. Otherwise, they'll have to stand still within the outskirts of the town, not developing further. The ceasefire will happen from the midnight between May 7th and May 8th until midnight from May 10th to May 11th. Further southwest in the direction of Novopil and Zelenopole, the Russians are now on the outskirts of both towns from the east and from the south. The Russians managed to gain control over several forest lines in the area, both along the main road and along the flanks of both towns. Reaching the outskirts of the fortified positions and the towns, the next battle will be over the fortified positions and the towns, where we still have to see whether the Russians will wait until after the ceasefire or whether they will already launch offensive operations now. But based on the current situation, they'll likely wait until the ceasefire is over, considering they haven't entered either the towns or the fortified positions yet. The Russians will then prepare, build up their forces, and once the ceasefire is over, they'll storm these towns along the border area between the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions, gaining control of the fortified positions and the towns. They'll then push further northwards along Vilnopole, Shevchenko, and then the defensive line of the Ukrainians here to the southwest. They'll look to gain control over the border area and expand their control across the entire Donetsk region. With regards to the Victory Day parade that will happen on May 9th in the Moscow region, there are still reports that the Ukrainians are planning on strikes towards the city, despite the Ukrainian claim that never mind, they're not going to strike Moscow. The Russians have significantly bolstered their air defense capabilities. They've also started jamming internet connections and much more GPS data and so on to prevent any large-scale strikes by the Ukrainians on Moscow. But if it happens, then according to some leaked information, the Russians have made a list over targets within Kiev, which they will plan to strike with Oreshnik missiles if the Ukrainians strike Moscow during the victory parade. Therefore, we may see some strikes between Russia and Ukraine, between the capitals, on May 9th, depending on how the situation develops. This is not extremely effective in terms of what will happen on the front line, but it is very significant diplomatically, as it will have a large impact, since officials from multiple countries will be visiting Moscow during the May 9th victory parade, including Xi Jinping himself, the president of China. Some official delegations from India and many other countries will be visiting Moscow during the parade. Therefore, a Ukrainian strike would be very dangerous and escalatory in terms of the diplomatic position of Ukraine on the global stage, which has become much more important following the developments in Pakistan and India. And I say this because Pakistanis actually performed much better than in even my wildest imaginations. That is due to the fact that they managed to shoot down some Indian fighter jets during the Indian attack, missile strikes on Pakistani territory. And this is very significant because Pakistan used Chinese weapons to shoot down Indian jets. The Indian jets used were mainly the Rafale fighter jet, which is a 4.5th generation fighter jet from France. It is very well built, it's very well designed. It is one of the top jets of the 4.5th gen fighter jets, and it was shot down by Chinese J-10C fighters, or the Pakistan-Chinese joint development version that used Chinese export model of the PL-15 missile, the PL-15E, which is an air-to-air missile. The fact that the Pakistanis used Chinese jets and Chinese missiles to shoot down French jets in India shows that the Chinese 4.5 gen jets may be better than the Indian ones. In this scenario, we can see that China seems to be stronger than many expect. And if the Chinese are able to outperform Western technology, despite the fact that China is actually, in terms of quantity, significantly superior to the entire West, Europe, and the United States combined, this shows that China is extremely powerful. And if Chinese export weapons can compare to the main weapons of France or European countries, that shows that third world countries, in terms of quality for their military equipment, just from the export models of Chinese weapons, can compare to the main weapons of European countries. That shows that third world countries are no longer inferior in terms of military compared to Europe or the United States. And countries such as Pakistan, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and so on, can compare to countries in Europe or the United States if the United States are spreading out their forces. The only country that can really compare to the United States today is, of course, China, but the situation differs. If the United States have to fight multiple countries, then they will be unable to dedicate their forces in one situation. This means Russia by itself is no longer a significant threat because Pakistan, India, can compare to Russia in terms of military strength. And that is a complete shift in the world order. It is no longer a unipolar world order, nor is it a split between China and the United States. Rather, it is a situation where any country that has nukes and has a strong military can compare to Russia or the United States. The situation has completely switched around compared to just 10 years ago, much less 50 or 80 years ago at the end of the World War II. What I want to say is the third world countries are going to be much more powerful going forward than before, both militarily, but also economically and diplomatically. And the opinions of third world countries become much more important in terms of the global stage. Ukraine has so far only focused on Western support, while the rest of the world doesn't really matter. But now we can see that the Russian attention on the third world has paid off more because the third world has shown to be much more powerful than first expected. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.